The last day of Kwame Nkrumah. On the morning of April 27, 1972, in a quiet clinic in Bucharest, Romania, a man died alone. No cabinet ministers stood at his bedside. No cheering crowds waited outside, as they once had by the hundreds of thousands. No state radio announcer in his own country prepared to break the news, because in his own country, his name could barely be spoken above a whisper. He was 62 years old. 12 years earlier, he had stood before the United Nations General Assembly and been applauded as the father of a continent's liberation. 6 years earlier, he had governed a nation of 8 million people, courted by Moscow and Washington alike, a friend to Nasser, to Nehru, to Castro, to Tito. He had once believed with total conviction that he would live to see a United States of Africa. One government, one currency, one army, stretching from Cairo to Cape Town. Instead, he died a guest in another man's country, a president without a country, treated for a cancer few around him were even permitted to name. This is the story of how Kwame Nkrumah, teacher, prisoner, prime minister, president, Osagyefo, the Redeemer, arrived at that hospital bed. And it is the story of his last day and the strange, bitter, and unfinished argument over what should be done with his body once he was gone. Part 1. The Making of a Redeemer. To understand why Kwame Nkrumah's death was so lonely, you first have to understand how loud his life had been. He was born Francis Nwiya Kofi Ngonloma in the small fishing and farming town of Nkroful in the Nzima area of the western Gold Coast in September 1909. Though for much of his life the exact date was uncertain, a detail he shared with many colonial-era Africans whose births were recorded, if at all, by missionaries rather than the state. His father was a goldsmith, his mother a trader. It was an unremarkable beginning for a boy who would go on to redraw the map of a continent's politics. Trained as a teacher at Achimota College, one of the Gold Coast's most prestigious schools, where he came under the influence of Pan-Africanist thinkers and began reading the work of Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the growing body of Black nationalist and Marxist thought circulating between Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. In 1935, Nkrumah left for the United States to continue his education, enrolling at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, a historically black college, and later the University of Pennsylvania. He would spend nearly a decade in America, earning multiple degrees, teaching, preaching part-time at black churches in Philadelphia, and immersing himself in the politics of the African diaspora. It was in America that Nkrumah's political philosophy hardened. Colonialism was not simply a moral wrong to be argued against in polite committee rooms. It was a system that had to be organized against, mobilized against, and if necessary, confronted in the streets. In 1945, he crossed to London, where he helped organize the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester alongside Du Bois and George Padmore, a gathering historians consider one of the pivotal moments in the intellectual formation of African independence movements. It was here that Nkrumah began to see himself not simply as a Gold Coast nationalist, but as part of a much larger continental and diasporic project. He returned to the Gold Coast in 1947, invited to become General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, a moderate nationalist party led by lawyers and businessmen who wanted gradual self-government. Nkrumah found their pace unbearably slow. In 1949, he broke away and founded his own party, the Convention People's Party, built not around chiefs and professionals, but around market women, ex-servicemen, clerks, and the urban poor. His slogan was blunt and electrifying: self-government now. The colonial authorities responded the way colonial authorities usually did. Nkrumah organized a campaign of strikes and boycotts he called positive action, was arrested, and spent time in jail, a detail that, far from damaging him, transformed him into a folk hero. In 1951, while still in prison, his party swept the first general election under the new constitution. The British governor had little choice but to release him and invite him to form a government. Nkrumah walked out of Fort James prison and, within days, became leader of government business, the effective head of an internal, semi-autonomous administration, an extraordinary reversal even by the standards of decolonization. 6 years later, on the night of March the 6th, 1957, Nkrumah stood before a jubilant crowd in the old polo ground in Accra and declared the Gold Coast independent under a new name, Ghana, after the ancient West African Empire. It was the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence from European rule. And Nkrumah, addressing the crowd, made a declaration that would echo across the continent for the following 2 decades. Ghana's independence, he said, was meaningless unless it was linked to the total liberation of Africa. That sentence was not rhetorical flourish. It became his life's mission. And, many historians argue, the reason his enemies at home and abroad eventually moved against him. Part 2, Osagyefo, President and Pan-Africanist. As Ghana's first prime minister and, from 1960, its first president, Nkrumah pursued an ambitious and often contradictory program: rapid industrialization funded by cocoa exports, free education and healthcare expansion, the construction of the Akasambo Dam and the Volta River hydroelectric project, and an activist foreign policy built around what he called African socialism and non-alignment in the Cold War. He hosted the first Conference of Independent African States in Accra in 1958, inviting the continent's small handful of newly independent nations to imagine common cause. He championed the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, arguing against more cautious leaders like Nigeria's and Ivory Coast's for nothing less than immediate continental political union. He gave sanctuary and support to liberation movements fighting colonial and white minority rule across the continent, from Algeria to South Africa to the Portuguese territories. Within Ghana, he took the honorific title Osagyefo, an Akan word often translated as the Redeemer or Victorious Commander, and image makers cultivated a personality cult around him. His portrait on currency, in classrooms, at every public building. But the same decade that built his reputation abroad hollowed out his political system at home. In 1964, after surviving multiple assassination attempts, Nkrumah pushed through a constitutional referendum, making Ghana formally a one-party state under the CPP, with himself as president for life. Political opponents were detained without trial under the Preventive Detention Act. The free press dwindled. Ghana's economy, overexposed to volatile cocoa prices and strained by ambitious state industrial projects, several of them poorly planned or corruptly managed, slid toward crisis. Foreign debt mounted. Shortages became common. Many ordinary Ghanaians, who had cheered him in 1957, grew resentful of both the austerity and the increasingly authoritarian character of his rule. It was, in the judgment of most historians, this combination: economic strain, domestic repression, and a foreign policy many Western governments and some African neighbors regarded as dangerously radical and destabilizing, that set the stage for what came next. Part 3, Operation Cold Chop. On the morning of February 24, 1966, while Kwame Nkrumah was thousands of miles away in Beijing, en route to Hanoi on a self-appointed peace mission to help negotiate an end to the Vietnam War, a group of Ghanaian army and police officers seized the arms depots, radio stations, and government buildings of Accra in a coup they codenamed Operation Cold Chop. The National Liberation Council, led by officers including Colonel Emmanuel Kwasi Katoka, announced the overthrow of Nkrumah's government to a Ghanaian public whose reaction, by most contemporary accounts, ranged from indifference to open celebration. Statues of Nkrumah were pulled down in the streets of Accra. The instruments of the personality cult he had built collapsed within hours. Questions about foreign involvement in the coup, particularly the possible knowledge or encouragement of Western intelligence services concerned by Nkrumah's Soviet and Chinese ties and his support for African liberation movements, have been debated by historians for decades and remain a subject of dispute rather than settled fact. What is not disputed is the outcome. Nkrumah, informed of the coup while still in Beijing, never returned to Ghana. He would spend the rest of his life in exile. Sekou Touré, the president of neighboring Guinea and a fellow Pan-Africanist, offered Nkrumah refuge, and did so with a striking gesture. Touré named Nkrumah co-president of Guinea, an honorary but symbolically loaded title meant to signal that Nkrumah remained, in Touré's eyes, a legitimate head of state robbed of his country, rather than a deposed leader with no claim left to make. Nkrumah settled into a villa in Conakry, continuing to write, receive visitors, and correspond with liberation movements and sympathetic governments. He published several books during this period, including Dark Days in Ghana, his account of the coup, and continued to insist, to the frustration of Ghana's new military government, that he remained Ghana's rightful president and would one day return. He never did. Part 4, The Long Exile. The 6 years Nkrumah spent in Guinea were, by most accounts, a mixture of intellectual productivity and increasing isolation. He remained convinced that agents connected to Western intelligence services and Ghana's military government were plotting against his life, a fear that was not entirely without foundation, given the political climate of the era, and one that shaped his increasingly guarded daily routine. He continued to write prolifically on neo-colonialism, on African unity, on what he called the class struggle within post-colonial Africa. While Ghana's new leaders worked to dismantle his political and economic legacy, and while a rotating cast of military and civilian governments took power in Accra through the following years, Nkrumah's health, meanwhile, began to fail. Ghanaian and Guinean sources differ on precisely when symptoms first became serious, but by the early 1970s, Nkrumah had developed advanced prostate cancer, an illness that in that era offered few effective treatment options, particularly for a patient living in a modest West African capital far from advanced oncological care. In August of 1971, on Touré's arrangement and with Soviet bloc medical assistance, Nkrumah was flown to Bucharest, Romania, to receive treatment his doctors judged unavailable in Guinea. Romania, then under the rule of Nicolae Ceausescu, maintained warmer relations with a number of non-aligned and socialist-leaning African governments than most of its Warsaw-pact neighbors, and had a functioning oncology treatment program willing to take Nkrumah as a patient. He would spend the last 8 months of his life there, largely out of the public eye, his condition known to only a small circle. Part 5, The Last Day. By the spring of 1972, Kwame Nkrumah's cancer had advanced significantly. He was being treated at a clinic in Bucharest. Some accounts place his final residence at the Lenin Hospital. Others reference the Flamingo Hotel, where he had been staying during treatment. The historical record here is imperfect, pieced together largely after the fact by journalists and biographers rather than documented in real time, since so few people were present. What the available accounts agree on is this. Nkrumah died without any member of his family at his side. His wife, Fataya Nkrumah, an Egyptian whom he had married in 1957, and their children were living in Cairo. Ghana's military government had not permitted, and in some tellings had not been asked to arrange, any reunion in his final weeks. He had been separated from his wife and children in practical terms since the 1966 coup. There was no elaborate deathbed scene of the kind that surrounded, say, Nasser's death 2 years earlier in Cairo, with the entire Arab world in mourning within hours. There was no waiting delegation, no cabinet, no press pool. By multiple accounts, Nkrumah's death on the morning of April 27, 1972, was quiet, undramatic, and largely unwitnessed. A stark contrast to a man who had spent his political life addressing stadiums and international assemblies. Word reached the outside world through Touré himself. As Guinea's president and Nkrumah's closest remaining political ally, it fell to Touré to announce the death publicly and to take charge of what would become a surprisingly contentious set of decisions. What should happen to the body and where Nkrumah should finally be laid to rest? A Ghanaian journalist writing shortly afterward captured the strange desolation of it, framing Nkrumah's end in language borrowed from Shakespeare's account of Caesar's assassination. Betrayed not by a single dagger, but by the accumulated weight of a country's rejection, dying, in his words, Alone in the agony of a Bucharest infirmary, far from the green and lovely homeland he had led into independence less than 15 years before. It is worth pausing on that contrast, because it is the emotional center of this story. In March 1957, Kwame Nkrumah stood in front of a jubilant crowd of tens of thousands in Accra's old polo ground, declaring Ghana's independence to the world. 15 years and 2 months later, he died in a foreign hospital bed in a country he had visited for medical treatment rather than diplomacy, with almost no one from his own country even aware, in the moment that he was gone. Part 6. A Body Without a Home. What followed in Nkrumah's death became its own strange political drama. Sekou Touré insisted on a full state funeral in Guinea before any consideration of returning Nkrumah's remains to Ghana. Nkrumah's body was flown from Bucharest and arrived back in Conakry on April 29, 1972, where, according to contemporary reporting, thousands of Guineans lined an 8-mile route from the airport into the city center to watch the motorcade pass. The body lay in state at the Guinean State House before a funeral ceremony held on May 13th, attended by a number of African heads of state and representatives from roughly 24 other countries. Though notably, Ghana's own military government, the National Redemption Council under General Ignatius Akiampong, sent only limited representation, reflecting the deep ambivalence Ghana's rulers still felt toward their deposed former president. Touré, by several accounts, used the funeral to press a set of conditions before he would agree to release Nkrumah's remains to Ghana at all, reportedly including demands that Ghana's government publicly renounce the 1966 coup, restore Nkrumah's toppled statues, and even relocate his tomb to a site in front of Ghana's own parliament building. Ghana's military rulers found these terms politically unacceptable, and for weeks it was genuinely unclear whether Nkrumah's body would be repatriated at all. It ultimately took direct diplomatic appeals from other African heads of state, including Presidents William Tolbert of Liberia, Siaka Stevens of Sierra Leone, and General Yakubu Gowon of Nigeria, to persuade Touré to release the remains without all of his original conditions bestowed. Kwame Nkrumah was finally buried in his hometown of Nkroful on July 9, 1972, more than 2 months after his death, and roughly 11 weeks of unresolved diplomatic wrangling over what a deposed African founding father's body was even owed by the country he had led to freedom. That was not, however, the end of the story. Years later, as Ghana's political mood shifted and later governments sought to formally rehabilitate Nkrumah's legacy, his remains were exhumed from the modest tomb in Nkroful and moved to a purpose-built national memorial park and mausoleum in Accra, constructed fittingly on the same site where he had declared Ghana's independence in 1957, the old polo ground. Today, the Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park stands there, a marble structure resembling an upended sword thrust into the earth, and it draws visitors from across Ghana and the African diaspora who come to see the final resting place of the man who ended British colonial rule south of the Sahara. Part 7. What he left behind. It is one of the more uncomfortable truths of African political history that Kwame Nkrumah's reputation improved substantially after his death, and did so precisely as the economic and political troubles of his final years in office receded from immediate memory, replaced by the far more chaotic decades of military coups and instability that followed his removal. The Organization of African Unity he had championed, initially built around the more cautious, gradualist vision of leaders who rejected his call for immediate continental federation, would in 2002 be reorganized into the African Union, an institution whose founding charter drew explicitly on the Pan-African ideals Nkrumah had spent his life advocating. In Ghana itself, successive governments would eventually declare September 21st, Nkrumah's birthday, a national holiday, Founders' Day, later renamed Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Day. Historians remain divided, as they were during his lifetime, on how to weigh Nkrumah's legacy. A genuine anti-colonial visionary who gave sub-Saharan Africa its first independent state, and inspired liberation movements across the continent. Against a leader whose later domestic record included the dismantling of political opposition, a costly personality cult, and economic mismanagement that left Ghana worse off, in material terms, than it had been in independence. Both of those Nkrumahs are part of the historical record, and neither cancels out the other. What is harder to dispute is the loneliness of his ending. A man who had once imagined and argued for a single, unified African nation, dying in a hospital bed in Eastern Europe, his own body becoming, for a few tense weeks in the summer of 1972, a subject of negotiation between two African governments who could not agree on what he was owed. Kwame Nkrumah once said that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked to the total liberation of the African continent. He did not live to see that liberation completed. No one has, not yet. But the marble mausoleum standing today on the same ground where he once declared Ghana free suggests that, whatever judgment history ultimately renders on his years in power, his country eventually decided he deserved to come home.